Everyone. I'm Dalen Johnson. I'm the campus internship coordinator here at AU, and then I also kind of help oversee student employment and how that relates to careers. So today we're going to be talking about how you can connect your on-campus job to your career. So first I want to talk about the NACE competencies. These are essentially soft skills that the National Association of Colleges and Employers has identified as skills that across the board pretty much every employer wants to see in a new grad, because we're seeing this big shift into skills-based hiring where it's more about the skills that you have versus the degree. So if you can talk about these skills on your resume, if you can talk about them in an interview, that's a great way to kind of give yourself a little bit of a boost into that job. So we have career and self-development, communication, critical thinking, equity and inclusion, leadership, professionalism, teamwork, and technology. These are all things that you probably already have that you're working on. And again, they're words that you really want to highlight as you're searching and applying for internships, jobs, no matter what the role is. So I really wanted to emphasize these and then show you how they are built in your on-campus job and then are also valuable in a career. So this is a real on-campus job that I found on Handshake, a peer tutor. And this is the position description, the responsibilities that you would have as a peer tutor. And you can kind of see with my color coding that all of these NACE competencies are built into this position. So establishing appointment goals based on student needs, that's an example of critical thinking because you're thinking about what that student needs in that moment and then kind of problem solving from there and making decisions based on that. You're thinking critically on how to do that. Working to establish goals, that's an example of career and self-development because you are helping the student develop, helping them improve, kind of working together in that way. Engaging students and facilitating active learning is an example of communication. Again, you're talking to them using different modes of communication to make sure they're understanding the work that you're tutoring them on. Promoting independent learning is another example of career and self-development because you're teaching, you're helping them improve while you're also improving your teaching skills. Fostering respect and a safe learning environment is an example of equity and inclusion. You're respecting a diverse audience, diverse learning styles, making everyone kind of feel safe and equal and equitable in that way. Giving class presentations about tutoring in the academic support center, another example of communication, public speaking. Maintaining strict confidentiality is an example of professionalism that you have to do in any job, whether it's HIPAA, FERPA, any other kind of privacy laws. Making appropriate referrals, that's another example of critical thinking where you're having to kind of take a step, think about what's happening, take a step based on that, thinking critically about what the next step should be. Other campus resources is an example of teamwork. You're collaborating with other departments and offices, making sure you know about those and you guys can work together to help the student. Being punctual for all scheduled tutoring sessions, an example of professionalism. Being on time is something that any job wants. Completing client reports at the conclusion of the appointment, another example of teamwork, because you're kind of sharing that with faculty, sharing that with the academic support center, and kind of collaborating from there. Serving as a university role model is an example of leadership, pretty self-explanatory. And behaving in accordance with core values and expectations is another example of equity and inclusion because AU's core values are related to diversity and equity and inclusion. A lot of these overlap, so you could have seen one and thought that's more of an example of technology, or that's more of an example, for example, the completing client reports at the conclusion of the appointment. That's something that you do on your computer, so that could be an example of technology too. So there's not a right or wrong answer, but as long as you can pick out specific details from the tasks that you're holding and then point them to a NACE competency, that's going to be really helpful in your interview and your application process. So now this is a real entry-level job that I found on LinkedIn, an entry-level medical office assistant. And you can see right here, they have all the same NACE competencies available in here. And they're things that they obviously want you to be able to do. So that's skills that they want you to have. So supporting daily administrative and clinical operations of the facility, career and self-development, because you're gaining valuable experience in the healthcare setting that shows that you're wanting to grow, wanting to learn a little bit more about that career field. Managing the office calendar is an example of technology, is probably online in Outlook or Google. Answering phone calls and responding to inquiries, that's an example of communication, pretty self-explanatory. Working in compliance with privacy regulations like HIPAA, example of equity and inclusion, because you're making sure everyone has the same access to privacy and isn't kind of slighted in any way because of bias. Assisting with insurance verification, billing, and processing payments is an example of critical thinking because you have to think about different like nuances and complexities related to insurance and billing. That requires a lot of critical thinking. Preparing examination rooms, making sure supplies are stocked, supporting clinical staffs with basic tasks. That's an example of leadership. You're taking ownership of that task and that responsibility and making sure it gets done. Faxing and emails, this is an example of technology again, because that's on a computer. Strong organization and multitasking skills, professionalism, that's something that's always going to look professional. They want you to be familiar with Microsoft Office suite and other systems. That's technology as well. Excellent communication and interpersonal skills. It directly says communication in there. So that's clearly a communication competency. They want you to have the ability to work effectively in a fast-paced and patient-focused environment. That's professionalism for that setting. That setting is fast-paced and patient-focused, and that's kind of how they want you to be able to behave. So that's an example of being professional in that environment and matching what the environment needs. And then these last three are all potentially examples of career and self-development. Understanding basic medical terminology shows that you are passionate about that field and wanting to grow in that field and learning different areas. If you have previous experience or certifications, that's another example of career and self-development that shows that you took the extra step to grow in that way. So you wanted to develop your career. Again, a lot of these can overlap. You could argue different skills for different areas. But again, as long as you can point to a skill, talk about something specific that you did, and then show that you can do it similarly in that other role and that it relates to a skill, that's going to be a great way for you to leverage yourself in that interview and as you're submitting applications. So that's all I have for now. We can talk about more of this in another video, but I just wanted to make you aware that there's a student employment Brightspace shell that will be starting in the fall and spring semesters if you're a student worker, with lots of other resources related to the NACE competencies and other incentives to kind of get you thinking about those competencies and how you're developing them in your on-campus job. Thanks.